And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. My name is Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor, and I'm joined, as always, by Maggie Parke. Maggie, we were going to follow up today. We ended last time talking about studios and sort of the question of what kind of an impact does it. We were talking about the question of Amazon as a corporate producer, and I was raising it as sort of an issue or as like an example of applied critfic, right? When people keep kind of collectivizing the thing, right? And speaking as if Amazon, this huge corporate entity, is somehow like spontaneously spawning out of a corporate boardroom or something this series. And that's of course not the case. This is, you know, a TV studio that is indeed owned by Amazon. They're the corporation is bankrolling it, but there are actual, artists involved with this and everything, and that, it's just at the very least sloppy and kind of avoiding the analysis work. Again, that's kind of the point of critfic, right? Just to say like, oh, it's gonna be bad because Amazon is doing it, or even to say everything that corporate studios produce is bad. Today, you wanted to dig in a little bit more into the question of like, what does it mean? Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about like a big studio versus a smaller indie studio? What's even kind of at stake? Because I think a lot of people sort of wave their hands at. And honestly, the impression that I get is that a lot of people are making, it sounds like a really simple kind of thing, right? Like Amazon is huge companies are evil, right? I've heard of evil things that Amazon as a corporation has done in other places. Therefore, like, they're huge, they're bad, and the stuff that they produce is probably going to be like bad. I mean, it feels like incredibly sloppy. Yeah. And I know I don't have very much understanding of how the process works, right? Like what's going on, what's going on behind the scenes, and in particular the question of like studio control and interference in the process, right?
And I'm not going to have a ton of answers, so I'll start with that. I mean, every single production is totally different, but I think it's worth us looking at like basics of the structure. So you can call this my weekly PSA if you want. This is just like, let's consider how this works and some things that we should be aware of, because I don't want to fall into the trap of crit-ficking this either, because it's real easy, having worked on a bunch of indies, to say studios are the devil. And then I worked on a couple of studios and you're like, oh dang, we get a lot done. It's like there's pros and cons to every single system. There are pros and cons to every human you work with or encounter. Like, there's so many different layers to this. But if we just want to look at some basics, I think it's helpful to look at some basics, because I don't know, there's a lot of things that I think I felt when I heard that Amazon was doing this. I do have my own frustrations with Amazon as a company, like ethically and financially. There are some questionable things going on that, if they offered me a show to do something, I think I would question whether I was going to take their money. There are certain things that you're like, but they are also the ones that are able to get this done. Very few other companies would be able to look at something like the Second Age and see how little there is about it and be able to say, here's a boatload of money, let's go get creative. It just wouldn't get done. So in terms of opportunities,
well, and I want to, there's something I feel like in the interest of truthfulness and honesty, we have to kind of confess here. I haven't heard a single person criticize the Tolkien estate for this. But honestly, if you hate the fact that a big, huge, major studio is doing this, that's the Tolkien estate's fault. The Tolkien estate started a bidding war on this. They put this out there and said, we're dangling the rights for this Second Age story. What you got, right? And there was, there were apparently bids from several major guess what? No indie studio was winning that auction. Right? I mean, like, that situation. So, like, the Tolkien estate they created a situation where only a big, huge, major, very wealthy studio would be able to afford it.
Well, and I presume they had the rights, literally and figuratively, to turn down those that bid for it. They could choose who they sold
Sure,
to, and
sure.
they sold to Amazon. So, you know, I don't think this is a thing that we can control. I think this is a thing that you can be annoyed by if you think Amazon is the devil, but it has happened. So let's just take a look at what could come, you know? So
Right.
I also fall into this trap of like, let's just try to focus on the work that's coming because there's so many other things that come into factor that yeah, anyway, did you sorry, I forgot to check before. Did you get the slides that I sent
I
over?
did. Yeah. Slides are up.
Okay.
Slides are up.
I was good. Oh, good. Sorry. So like let's pop those up just so I can try to keep on track. But have you met
Yeah.
us?
Yeah.
We don't do that. So I thought it was useful just to like look at some of the real basics. I've only got three slides.
Hmm.
Um, Studio versus indie, I feel like are just terms that are thrown around a lot,
Right.
and there's not a clear definition of what that means. If you say something is a studio film versus an indie film, that usually just means money and who's doing it and how they work.
Okay.
There's not a clear definition for any of that. But in like basics, studio has a big pot of money. They don't have to chase around town trying to get funders to get something made. They have the money, they
Okay.
have the talent, they have the people that are salaried to do things like scout locations and figure out, you know, contracts for how late can we run a generator in that neighborhood, you know, things like
Yeah,
that, down to the
that's actually
specific.
so. I have a question about that because I've
Yeah,
never understood this. And by the way, total, I understand if you don't know the answer to every single one of
I'll
my
try.
questions, but okay, how many like of the people who work on a movie for a studio? How many of like this is so one thing I've never understood is like you always hear about like they went out and they got this person to do this movie and they got this other person, you know, obviously actors, right, you know, they're going out and getting individual actors and they're getting a director and stuff, but like where does it sort of like stop, like at what point are the people who are working on that movie like the employees, the regular employees of that studio?
Like on the actual production, I would say not too many are salaried. The actual
Okay.
production are going to be the people that are hired to make that film. But the people that oversee all the productions are going to be steady.
Right.
So the people that figure out, you know, like any company, the people that figure out your HR, your finance, you know, your
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
schedules, your contracts, your deliveries, like all that stuff is probably going to be static and studio salaried.
Right.
Everything else, especially if it is some sort of a craft or skill, is going to be hired specifically for the project. So that would be a freelance person, like a director, a DP, you know, the lighting crew, the film, the
Okay,
greens
so
crew,
even
all
like yeah,
those
like
people are
lighting
gone
crew,
on.
the you know sound people, the like all that like all of those production people are all hired just and they might work for another studio, you know, next year
Exactly. I'm
and
like,
what? Okay,
yes, they're hired in, but it might be like, you know, Industrial Light and Magic is brought in. Well, Industrial Light and Magic has a ton of salaried people.
right,
So they
right,
might be freelance for that project, but they're going to have a load of people that that's just their job. So they're always there anyway.
yeah,
So it's not like we're just bringing in that random guy to do the edit because he's
right.
real
They're not
good. That's more
right,
indie.
right.
Yeah.
They're tending to do so that they'll tend to hire like groups or companies like that, like a lighting group or and like a you know like a CG group and that kind of
In
thing.
theory, yeah, it would probably be a lot more subsidiary companies, or it would be like one person that has their own crew. So, like, especially if it's something technical like lighting or sound, like I worked on a short where they got the guy that did the sound for Hurt Locker, which was an Academy Awards nominated thing. So it was short, you know, it was a 12-minute film. But
Right.
because they got that guy, it had a lot of street cred and, you know, helped us get additional funding. And he brought his crew with him. So all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, the sound on that short was fantastic, you know?
Right. Right.
So there's like these little appeals that if you can get that guy, he's going to bring his buddies.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what was I saying before that?
Let's see. We were talking.
Companies.
Yeah, we've been talking about salaried versus like bringing people in, um,
Oh, just compared to indie. Yeah. So
compared to indie.
it's
Yeah.
process and like process kind of goes along with that. So people in process, like I have those bullet points there, but like they're kind of all the same thing. People in process are, I think, the other differentiating elements here. So like when you have a studio film, the people do the process. Whereas in an indie film, the people dictate the process. So,
Hmm.
like, if you're working on an indie film and you've got this director and this DP, the way they work is the way you're going to
I got.
work.
Can I just ask? DP. What is
Director of
DP?
photography.
Director of photography. Got it. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
Yeah,
This is my job, is to ask the ignorant questions because I don't know that much about the back end.
And I forget that I asked. I mean, my first job, that's all I did was ask all those stupid questions like, what does a key grip do? What is the best boy?
Don't tell me. Don't even tell me what the best boy does, because it's always been one of the things that I've enjoyed imagining when I see the credits. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
He's just the
I'm
best
sure.
boy.
I'm sure the reality
best.
would be much less interesting than what the things I've imagined at various points. But anyway, go ahead.
Acronym wise, you're probably just going to hear AD and DP. DP is director of photography, and AD is assistant director. So those are kind of the main like acronyms you hear. An assistant director, you'll have like the first AD, the second AD, the third AD, and you work your way up to becoming the D, the director. Got a bit crude. But yeah, I think that's the difference too, that on a studio film, I mean, if you're hired to be the third AD, you're following Amazon's rules. Like you will do what is expected of you. You turn in the payroll, you turn in the hours, you show up when you're contractually expected to do so. Whereas in an indie, if you're the DP, it's probably more at the whim of the artist that you're working with. So you kind of figure it out together. And sometimes people don't know what they're doing and they're being a bit more guerrilla filmmaking. And it's just a little less structured or regulated, I guess you could say. But sometimes that's where the creative stuff gets to shine. So
can I want to ask a little bit more about that. So
yeah.
You're talking about when you're talking about the artist with the indie, who is that exactly?
All of them?
Tend to, so like the artists plural, so like meaning like you're working with the actors and with the director and with the and you're kind of figuring those things out, whereas there isn't anybody. So who's in an indie film, whose like vision is being pursued usually? I mean, because is there a vision?
There is. I mean, there should be. There should be. Sometimes there isn't,
okay.
And they get funding, then you get a bad film. But there should be, and I would say often it's a writer, director, producer, some combination of those three. So if you have a writer, producer, maybe it's those guys that then hire the director to get that thing done, or maybe it's a writer, director that then finds a producer to get that thing done. But it's somewhere in that triumvirate of power. That a vision is
writer,
created.
Producer, director. By the way, to ask an even more ignorant question, what exactly does the producer do?
Oh, this is such a complicated. This is
a
complicated one too. I mean, this is probably a different presentation, but the producer is the one that gets stuff done. Let's just fund it that way. If you see executive producer, usually that would mean creative control and some money. Straight up producer, I would say, is like the one that gets something done. So I will put all this together.
By get something done, you mean like boss people around and get people moving in the right direction? Like they're the people who are like actually setting up, like handling logistics and stuff like that? Is like
maybe
that
before the shoot? Maybe before the shoot begins, but they're probably more like the people that will line up, the people that will do that. So if I'm hired as a line producer to do the casting, I would then, find the casting director, find the office that we can rent for the weekend, call all the casting agencies with the descriptions that we're going to do, send all of that out. It's basically like a glorified secretarial stuff of like, here's all the things that we need. I will facilitate all that happening.
So kind of back end stuff.
Yeah.
Organizational
And so
stuff.
when the actual shoot starts, the producers usually just sit there quietly, looking very superior and judgy to whatever is happening, because they won't actually weigh in to what's actually happening unless they need to. So sometimes they have to step in because something is going off script or off, if it's very different than what the writers had discussed. Because sometimes you do get that, like especially with serial TV. You think about like Supergirl or one of those kind of series where they would hire somebody in to do one episode. The director is hired in to direct that episode the way it was written. So it's quite tricky sometimes when that director comes in and has their own opinions of, well, no, I don't want it done that way. I want to do it this way. And then the producer would have to step in and be like, actually, no, this is the way we're doing it. But that's more like serial TV. That's pretty rare that you would have a producer step in a film. They'll get dailies, which is like short little versions of the stuff that was filmed that day. So they'll take a look at the dailies and then they'll provide feedback if there's something different. Like, oh, I really didn't like, the angle that you're filming Aragorn. Can we try an upshot so he looks more superior or something like
Right.
that?
Right.
Excuse me.
Okay.
But
So,
it's pretty
but
rare
they
that
are
producers would
they
yell at
are
people
kind of
over it.
like related to, almost like sort of safeguarding that kind of creative vision, or at least that can be a way
It can
in a
be.
sense.
I would like
Yeah.
to say they should be, but I
Okay.
don't know enough producers to say that. The ones I've met have been very careful about stepping back from the creative process once it's underway and letting the people do what they do, but also being very firm with their opinion and stepping in when they need to. So I
Right.
quite like that. They're also the ones that tend to line up the money. So,
Okay.
they have a really good eye on the budget. They understand where things need to be, when and how, and they might not write the contract, but they'll look over the contract, that kind of stuff.
Okay. 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 So, and you said sometimes the producer can be centrally involved in like the core vision for like an indie film, can be like centrally involved in the core vision sometimes.
Totally.
If it's like a director who, a writer director, writer is normally like the vague impression I have is that like the person who writes the screenplay is like that's that my own stereotyped image of like how an indie film works, right? Is that you've got like person who writes screenplay, right? And then they convince somebody to give them some degree of funding, and then they find people to help to make it work. So I always imagine the writer of the screenplay as like but maybe that's not the case.
I hate to keep
It,
saying it, but it depends,
it depends,
I,
right?
I mean, like in general, I mean, like some of the stuff that I've worked on was like, smaller indie type things. Like Film Cymru is one where it's grants that will help smaller, newer talent fund basically. So you could apply for a grant from Film Cymru, which is the Welsh Film Board, to like, I'm a writer, I want to write a script, but I'm matched up with this producer. So this producer has 4 credits to their name with BBC. Then basically it means like that producer has a stake in what I'm working on, and you're more likely to get the funding if you're partnered with somebody that has
Right,
some street cred.
right.
So like you'll often see this writer producer combination
Mm-hmm.
all the way from teeny tiny indie all the way up to Steven Spielberg, like Jerry Bruckheimer. They've worked with the same team with a lot of their projects because they work well together. So you'll see a lot of repeat producer directors and a lot of
Okay.
directors that turn into producers and vice versa because it's a symbiotic relationship.
Okay. Okay. So they'll
Sometimes you'll see
often team up.
executive producer as well, especially the big name stuff that we're talking about.
Right.
The like, Suzanne Collins was executive producer on The Hunger Games. Finally, Stephanie Meyer got a say in Twilight towards the last of the series and was executive producer. But that was a renegotiation of contracts. But basically, that just means they're going to financially put in, so they financially get back as well. So, like, I'm sure they had a say because everybody that has that title has a say, but that
Is
doesn't
that
necessarily mean they called up the casting agency to,
right?
file the
Right. They're not
paperwork.
actually doing the groundwork or anything. So
Mm,
executive producer then that so from the outside that sounds like the executive producer is the big boss producer and is in charge of all of the like underling producers who are in charge of all of the sub underling producers. But if you have somebody like, you know, Stephanie Meyer being brought in as an executive producer. She's not being brought in as executive producer because of her vast experience in producing films, right? She's being
right.
brought in because she wrote the books. And so it's understandable why you might or might not want to give her creative say, right? And as
Yeah.
you say, she's a stakeholder, you know, for sure, and that makes sense. But it would seem that like she's from the outside it seems weird, or rather it seems to challenge my idea of what an executive producer is, right? If she's like, because I mean obviously she's not going to be actually like giving orders to the
Yeah.
producers who are doing the work because she doesn't know anything about the work, right?
And the executive can be the absolute big boss, like definitely the executive producer, Steven Spielberg, he probably is the big boss in a lot of the stuff, especially if it's Amblin Entertainment, which is his own company. Like,
Right.
yeah, you're going to be the CEO, but that doesn't probably mean that you're on the ground. You've probably deputized that somebody else is actually going to be at the shoot, but you're still the big boss. So you get the dailies or you get the weekly report or whatever.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, Stephanie Meyer, Suzanne Collins, probably not. Also because they joined a little bit later on, and without that vast experience, I would
Right.
hope there was some sort of a mediating coaching alongside to be like, here's where we step back,
Right.
and
Right. Or
you've
even
had your
like,
say,
yeah, I mean,
but they
they
probably
might
had a
have
lot
an
more say.
idea, right? I mean, I'm imagining like, okay, like just like in like crazy theoretical world, somebody made me an executive producer, right? I know
Yeah.
nothing about like actual shooting and stuff, so I could look at dailies and say, I don't really like this shot of Aragorn, but I wouldn't know how to fix it. I wouldn't know what
Yeah.
recommendation to make, and so again, hopefully, one would have. So I could say like, no, here's like I kind of this is the effect I would want to have for Aragorn here. That
And
would be
that's
better than
exactly,
the
yeah.
effect that's here, and then
And that's
and
exactly
then
what I
they can
mean.
figure it out.
You would have that team to be like, this doesn't feel right. I really want him to feel strong and powerful. And they'd bring in the DP and the lighting guy and the director to like talk through it. But most
Right.
of that actually would have been done well before the shoot. So you
Right.
would have been involved as executive producer, especially if it was your own text, much
Right.
earlier on with drafts and storyboarding and things like that. Because
Right.
once it comes to shooting, like the main job is to just shoot what is written. Like
Right.
there's not a lot of room for creative interpretation once the shoot has begun because there's strict schedules to maintain, and
Right. Right. You
literally
can't
every minute that
extemporize
things are
so much.
running costs a
Yeah.
fortune. So
Right.
yeah.
Right.
At indies there's a little bit more flexibility because they're not as rigid as that, but studios are going to be big budget, big schedule. We're using a sound stage, the next one's booked in for 3 days after this one wraps, they're very
Right.
much boom 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 boom.
Right. Right. Okay. So thinking again, just sort of thinking vaguely here, and this is me just trying to. I'm sorry, this has become like remedial how films are made class,
This
but
is this
but
is
it's
great.
this will help me a lot as because I keep hearing, this has been a problem of mine as I keep hearing people be like, oh, like did you hear that this person is producing this, and I'm like, not only do I not know what implication that has, I don't even know what that person does. So, like, I don't know. Anyway, okay, so
Well,
this is
and
very
you're still
helpful.
not going to. And like
I'm
also I
still not
still don't
going
have
to, right?
I
Yeah, right.
still don't have all the answers. So I want to
Disclaimer, yeah,
yeah.
this is
I
still,
definitely
right.
want to clarify. I don't have all the answers, but I'm just saying like the producers, sometimes they are the single person that got that thing done. They got all the money, they lined up all the cast and crew, they were at every day of the shoot. Sometimes the producers just put their name on a line to get a thing made. So I
Right,
think of it because I also come from academia. I think of it as like I'm the first author of this paper,
right,
but
right,
I didn't
sure.
do anything on it. My PhD students did all of it on it. So
Right,
like,
exactly. So you're a professor and you've got 4 graduate students working in your lab, and they've
mhm.
done all the work, but it's your article because it was your lab and they were under your
Yeah.
direction. Right. Okay.
But
Right.
they wouldn't have gotten published without your name on it. So like the
Right.
film wouldn't have gotten made without that person signing off on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Sorry,
good.
well, sorry, I interrupted you. What were you gonna
No,
ask?
I was gonna say that that's a good parallel, but we should stop talking about this before I start ranting about the scholarly publication industry. So anyway, the
There's a
point
reason we don't
is,
do that.
the point is, okay, great. So the okay, I think I have a better idea of the producer's role, but would it be fair to say that like the producers in general, like executive and otherwise, right? The producers in general are they have a kind of like ownership over like seeing that the movie or the show comes out like it's supposed to, right? Like that's the
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair overall. Again, there's always gonna be exceptions and generalizations, but like, I mean, if I said I want to be a producer, to me that means project manager to a certain
mm-hmm,
extent. Like,
mm-hmm,
you have to be able to see the big picture. You have to be able
right,
to manage people and let them be gifted where they're gifted and reel them in where you can and lift them up, all these
right,
things that are just like very nuanced about management. So I don't think people think about it in terms of a business structure. You just hear producer and go,
right,
ooh, but it's actually like, no, that person's like filling out the spreadsheets and,
right,
making sure the lines line up and sitting quietly during the shoot on their laptop in the back, making sure everything's clear and still making sure everybody's happy. And like, again, not every producer does this, but I do think of them as like a project manager. And a
so
good project manager knows what's
right,
going on, can
right.
take
So
care of the story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So to ask the similar question another way, when you have a film and and everyone's like, this thing was a complete train wreck, right? Like it's all over the place, and like people, like like this stuff was good, but this other stuff and the editing is crap, and oh my goodness, that means bad job by the producer.
Not
I mean, I
always,
know there are other people
Corey.
involved in the badness, obviously, but
Yeah,
again, like if the producers are the ones who are kind of like in charge of making sure that things kind of come together, if it doesn't come
yeah.
together, that's a little, at least.
Yeah, I mean, they should be quality control, but you never know if the producers also have the studio finance behind them saying, well, that's too bad.
Right,
We have to get this out by Christmas, and you can't, I'm thinking Philip Pullman, and you can't reference any of that atheist stuff. You got to cut it. And all of a sudden you have to cut 40 minutes of your finished film. Like,
right,
you just don't know who else is at the table, and there's so
right,
many voices at the table, especially with a studio film, that I think that's where it sometimes gets this reputation, because we don't know who to blame, we don't know
right,
who we're mad at. It's just
right,
these faceless people, and they seem very money driven, so it's very much Oz wizard behind the curtain saying do this,
right.
and there's always a scapegoat. So, like, you could say in editing, or oh, we had to change directors last minute. The Zack Snyder, Joss Whedon example. Did I talk about that?
Mm-mm.
The
No.
Justice League. I think I just talked about that in Gabriel's class, but
Okay. Yeah.
Justice League came out, and Zack Snyder was the original director, and had to bow out towards the end of it because he lost a child to suicide, which was awful. And
Yeah,
of course, he
it's
had to be with
horrible.
his family.
Yeah.
And they brought Joss Whedon in to finish it, and everything beautiful about it was cut, and really lovely arcs, and a lot of people of color, and a lot of lines from strong women, like some really questionable stuff that now we know a little bit more about Joss Whedon. We're kind of going, um, but it ended up being a
It is an
very,
interesting kind of experiment in that way, right? To
right,
kind
isn't
of
it just?
see, yeah, like let's
And
just
everybody,
change one variable and then see what
and
happens,
then
right?
see what happens.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah,
what I mean. I mean, they just changed the director really far into production.
yeah,
Storyboarding should have been done, script should have been done, and yet so many things changed. So where was the quality control there?
right.
Because should it have been with the studio? Should it have been with the producers? And I mean, this is a personal opinion, but I do think DC's kind of always been a little bit too many cooks in the kitchen, whereas
Hmm.
Marvel has four or five people that know
Right,
the entire arc, and they are
right,
very strong. Like the people in the Tolkien sets, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that.
right,
They're
right.
quality control, but I don't know if DC has that. That's my speculation. Anyway, so they brought Zack Snyder back to do his own cut, and it was 2 hours longer than any film has ever been. and and it was fantastic. Like, all of a sudden you understood the big bad, and you understood his motivations, and the arcs of the characters made sense, and it wasn't a perfect film, but it was so much better.
Right,
And that was
right.
just changing the variable of the director. So I don't know who's always in charge of this quality control, and that was a huge budget film from a major studio, and if they can't control the quality, I mean, that is a really good experiment. You're just changing the director, and that's what happened.
Yeah, no, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, so,
Mm.
but I've kind of gotten us away in all of my nitpicky questions. I've kind
What?
of gotten us away from so we were talking about how like you've got the initial creative vision for the film or the series, right, in an indie, right, which might be like a, as you say, it might be like a writer producer team, maybe a writer director team, producer director, whatever. So they have the central vision, and then they're on a low budget, so they're like finding usually like what, individual people, rather than like, we're not gonna like hire this mega lighting firm, we're gonna like find a few lighting folks or whatever. Anyway, okay, so they're like finding the people, and there's nobody else as the boss of them, except, wait, where are they getting their funding from, and does their funding have any say in this process at all?
Yes, but their funding might be four people at a table. It might
Right,
be a lot smaller and a lot more identifiable.
okay,
The examples I know are the British film system, so it could be like BBC Films, which is a big corporation, or BFI, Film Institute. Like, they are big companies, but they're very, very much individuals. Like, I got a grant for a training thing from the BFI, so it's this huge British Film Institute, I don't know, machine.
right,
But I'm talking to two people, and I know
right.
these two people so well, and they know me really well. So I feel like each pot of money has a specific human behind it that you work with.
Okay.
So I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit more of that one to one that helps control it a little bit.
Okay. So then let's talk about studio control and like what kind of, because you mentioned before about like studios dictating the rules and that kind of taking the place of some of this initiative. How does a studio film work? I mean, like, okay, so to give one example, let's talk about New Line and Peter Jackson, right? So, I mean, there's like everybody, or many people, I think, have heard the story, right, of how like Peter Jackson came and pitched them, and he was afraid to pitch 3 films, and so he was kind of pitching 2 films for the Lord of the Rings originally, and then they were like, this really should be 3 films, right? Anyway, so that the story, like the stories that Peter Jackson told about that, suggest we have like Peter Jackson has the vision for doing these films, like, so he has the creative vision, and he goes to the studio and says, will you fund this, like, will you make this? So is that kind of normal? Is that how it normally happens, or no, that's not normal?
No, and I mean, I don't want to critique this either, because I don't have inside information about the talks that happened behind closed doors, but we all know the stories. And like, when you hear about studio, it's pretty straightforward what you do. It's going to be this many weeks. It's going to be this soundstage. Here's the paperwork. Go forth and do your thing. So for somebody to pitch something differently structured like that doesn't necessarily have the massive track record that you would expect. I mean, Peter Jackson didn't have the massive track record that you would expect for something like this. So to pitch 3 films shot at once with a budget of, what was it, about 93 million per film, so about 270 million total, and a world away from Hollywood. That was the big one. That was the one that I was surprised by, that they were perfectly happy for him to go to New Zealand to shoot this, because who shoots in New Zealand? Like, maybe they could consider London because they have subsidiary offices there, or maybe we would consider, some of these other places where LA often goes to shoot on location, but New Zealand was not in the realm of consideration
of normal. Yeah.
So, no, I think that's really different. And so I think that's another thing where you can say, like, studios are this way, indies are this way, but actually it's never that cut and dry, because that is New Line Cinema. That is a major studio.
Right.
But here they are doing something that is a little bit different. And it's not indie.
Right.
But it's a little bit different.
So and how does it normally work then? Does like the studio come up with ideas for the movies that they want to do, and then they find the people to do them?
Occasionally, but it's usually the other way around. So like, if I'm a producer writer, I would go to the studios first to pitch my ideas, because then I don't have to shop around for 18 different pots of money. I can just go to the studio and they're going to fund my movie. Okay. If they turn it down, then maybe I go to like a lower grade studio. And if they turn it down, then maybe I start going to the higher level indies, and you just kind of, work your way through it. But if you get to an indie, and you're pitching something that should be $100 million, it's not going to happen. I mean, there are some big budget indies, and indies are not defined by budget, but like, when you're talking about this differentiation, you often hear about the 2 and 20 million line, which I think I have on one of these slides. Like, I don't know where this came from, but I hear about it all the time. Like, 2 million tends to be the idea for an indie budget.
Oh yeah.
20 million and up tends to be like a studio. Like, I guess it's easier to find 2 million than it is to find 20, because if it's 20, then you're going to go to a studio and get one person to give you a big chunk of money. But 2 million is still hard to find. Like, you still are going to have to crowdsource that from a lot of different places. But yeah, so budget doesn't necessarily mean budget versus studio versus indie, but it can be a good signifier of like, I only have to go to one studio and get a buttload of money.
Right. Okay. So compare and contrast publishing house, movie studio. Like, so publishing house, you're an author, you've written a book, or you want to write a book, you send a pitch, right, to a publisher. You've got the editors who receive like thousands and thousands of pitches, right? And so they like read the first chapter of your manuscript and they're like, this is awesome, we want to publish it, let's do this. Or no, right? Is there somebody who works at the studio who's like that? I mean, is that kind of, so is like, I've got a screenplay, like I have a brilliant movie, I'm gonna go like pitch it to 20th Century Fox and see what they think? Like, is that no?
No, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've kind of ignored the concept of agents here,
Well, yeah, I was
and
ignoring
production
that with
companies.
the row with the publishing house too.
Yeah.
But
So like
yeah, yeah.
there's two different paths. So like there's production companies and there's agents. So if
Okay.
I'm a writer and I have an excellent script,
Yeah.
I'm either going to go to a production company that has a reputation of making movies with Netflix or Fox or whatever, and say to them, I really want Netflix to make this film. Here's why, and get them on board because then they would take it. You can't just email Netflix and say, I have a great idea. There's no open calls to go to
Right.
Netflix, you know?
Right.
So you either have to have a relationship, excuse me, or have an advocate to build that relationship. So the advocate would be your agent. So if you are a writer or a director, and you're constantly looking for work, you have an agent.
Right.
They tend to take, 10% of your income or whatever your fee is,
Yep.
and they
Yep.
find you work. So they will help make your script better. So I have a friend that's an agent specifically for writers, and she just works with improving these scripts and shopping these scripts around, and
Yes.
going up to studios and them saying, "We're really looking for a scary movie for preteen girls to watch at sleepovers." So then okay, it has to be PG 13. It has to have this kind of leading, and you start shopping around and finding what you
Right.
have, and that's when you go to the agencies. So
But that's the kind of thing that the studio is going to do. The studio decides. They don't come up with the idea for the movie. They say, we want a scary movie for teenage girls.
that's one option.
That's one option.
or
Yeah.
or they have relationships with people that have always brought them good stuff and say, pitch me your top 5 ideas. So pretty much like, I think producers would probably constantly have a calendar that's just these meetings with studios, and they would go in to pitch an idea, but they are always going to have 3 or 4 in their back pocket, because you're not going to have one of these meetings where they're not going to say, what else are you working on,
Right. Right.
which I feel like is very like twirl my mustache Hollywood movie, what else you got,
Right.
But
Right.
I
Right.
think that is how it works. Again, I haven't sat in these rooms, but like, all the development conversations I've had has just been like, yep, that's you pitch it until somebody wants to make it, and you always have some backup ideas. And you always know how to pitch your movie too. There's like the 30-second elevator pitch, the 2-minute I have a little bit more time pitch, the 10-minute presentation pitch, and the 20-minute fund my movie pitch.
Right. 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 Okay. Um, so what kind of controls tend to be in place? So when people talk about like the studios interfering and like the people talk as if films made by studios, right, are like these soulless, empty commercial things compared to like indie films, right? Um, what is how much reality is behind that, and like wherein lies the reality behind that? Like what kind of dictates, what kind of controls do studios tend to place on things, on films produced?
It could be massive. I mean, if it's an untried director or a young studio exec that's in charge of being on location for that shoot, that's trying to prove themselves. I mean, there's so many like individual human factors that
Right.
could affect the controls that are happening, and the relationship between those guys and the director, and how overscheduled they are and how far behind they are. There's so many factors that I think can factor into that it's like, I'm not sure is the short answer. Um, but I think the idea of somebody being in charge of it and having that overall vision is something that indie is kind of celebrated for.
Okay.
And you have this artist that has an idea, but there's also a lot of studios that have indie labels. So like
Mm-hmm.
it's not this like clear magical
Right.
artistic thing. Like you have Fox Searchlight, you have Miramax, like you have these big studio indie crossovers. It just means they're
Mm-hmm.
smaller budget, but they're made with the same kind of creative control. But when you have a studio that can kind of take a step back and just let them go on and do their own thing, a little more laissez-faire, go be creative, which I think is more Amazon style, again, speculating, but they seem to find the talent they want to be the showrunners and trust them. I'm sure there's a lot of quality control and there's a lot of reporting back because it's a lot of money, but there does also seem to be this go forth. and see what happens. I don't know what the difference there is, because some of the stuff that I've heard from some of these big budget studio ones is the detriment is how much money there is.
Right.
That there's pros and cons to this. When you have a really limited budget, it makes you be creative. Like, that's such a cliche line, but like, if you have a low budget, you have to be creative. If you have a big budget, you get to be creative. And I don't know, there is a certain amount of truth to that, that with some of these big studios, like, some of the rumors I've heard about New Zealand and what's happening down there is that the Amazon people are literally buying property so nobody else can make anything on that property. So no other production is happening in New
Right.
Zealand because Amazon has bought the property. They're not even filming on it. They've just bought it. It's like they have so much money, they're just buying land. It's just so you can't shoot on it. That's where I think they might
Yeah.
run into some issues with reputation. Like,
Right.
ooh,
Right.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as somebody who has been operating a very small budget for several years now at
Yeah.
Signum University, I understand what you mean about creativity, right? And I certainly do think there are many things that, like we at Signum have done. And one, I mean, like, when I think about some of the ways in which we do some things differently from other universities, like, there's one obvious reason that we do, and that's that we don't have the money that other universities do, and so we have to do things differently. But a lot of times that has pushed us to say, like, well, okay, since throwing money at this problem and just, like,
Mm-hmm.
hiring somebody with lots of credentials to do this job is not an option, what do we do instead, right? And then that's a great stimulus for creativity, and we've
Yeah.
been there lots of times. So I can certainly understand how that
Mm-hmm.
can work, and how a big budget um, uh, doesn't necessarily mean
And it's like
better.
so many things where like somebody pitches something and they're so convincing and amazing, you give them that creativity, but then maybe they can't deliver. Maybe they're just really good at pitching. So
Right.
like you're always going to kind of run that. So I would have loved to have seen Peter Jackson's pitch, because he must have been incredibly convincing. To
Yes.
then also have that freedom alongside that support is
Yes.
pretty big
Yeah.
and unique.
Yeah. Yeah. Kat Sass was just saying that necessity is the mother of invention. When you can't afford a big, impressive-looking spaceship, you come up with a blue police box and work with that. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think that's a wonderful example, Kat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's funny, Kat, right? Because people would, nowadays not think of Doctor Who as like the low budget indie example, but of course in the 60s it absolutely was. I mean, looking at the apparent budget of like the first 10 seasons of Doctor Who is pretty funny.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah,
And
yeah,
same with like with different. I mean, we're digressing now, but like also when you're talking about adaptations of, the thing I said at the beginning, when you're writing a book, you have no concept of budget because it's just your imagination. You can do anything you want. And the example I always use is Neil Gaiman's Stardust, where
right,
he created a flying pirate ship with Robert De Niro as the effeminate pirate, and he says that he remembers going on set and seeing them building this flying pirate ship and saying, "Sorry, I could have made it a cart." Like he could have made it a cart, but he made it a flying spaceship. So things you get to do when you have a different budget.
right, right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay, so more, yeah, and we kind of covered your some of your budget stuff as well. But this is
Yeah.
not
I
to
want
say
to,
that like we don't want to turn it around and say like, so the worst thing that can happen to a film is that it has a decent budget, right? Like that
not
is
at all.
also
Yeah. But
definitely
like,
not the case.
okay, here's my PSA on budgets. Like I love budgets. Whenever I give a lecture on film, you will hear me talk about how much a film costs to make and how much it made at the box office, because I find it fascinating. And the picture I've got here is just some random Google image example budget, but I love looking down the lines and just seeing what everything is. And when I was working on Twilight, and the bit you got back was like how much the mushroom ravioli cost to have on the table for the restaurant scene, and just all these things that were just so specific. And I love that level of detail in my very OCD way.
Right.
But I do think it's huge to just know that budgets are not the be all end all, and there's so many factors that go into them. So, I mean, if you're interested in this, just Google example budgets and you'll see kind of a rundown of how budgets are broken down for some of the bigger Hollywood films. And did I put it on here? There's like the four categories: above, below, post, and other. So like above the line, below the line, post production, and other. Above the
Right.
line is like all the talent, that's all the salaries.
Right.
So if your above the line costs include Robert Downey Jr. and Jennifer Lawrence and Julia Roberts, like you're talking 20, 30, 40 million for some of these people.
Right.
So your above the line cost is going to be massive.
Right.
Your below the line cost is going to be your production costs. Like our big Hollywood films, production costs start at like 45 million, 60 million, and go up, especially including, all the location rentals and props and costumes. And if it's a period film, it's going to be way more than that. And, all these things. So you've got that. And then post is all the editing, the CG, the music, all that stuff. And then others like legal stuff
Right.
that people always forget about, but it's really expensive to do some of these things legally. So yeah, that's just like the four divisions. So if your talent is massive, the budget's going to be massive.
Mm-hmm.
I just did, again for Gabriel's class, I just did this bit on the King Arthur Guy Ritchie film, and the budget for that was 175 million. That's insane for a film that crashed massively and no sequel was made. And that's what most of the feedback was. Like this film should have been 60 to 90 million. And then if it made a lot of money, you could throw more money at it for the second one. But for the first one, it should have been, much lower production costs, much lower talent costs.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. So yeah, it's just like, and again, the example I often use is Twilight, where like the budget for the first Twilight film was 37 million. The budget for the second one was 112 million. So yes, they knew they had an audience, so they put
Right.
more money into it to make it better. But also the fees for those actors went from 1 million to 12 million.
Right.
So it's just worth being aware of all the factors, because when somebody says, "Ooh, 150 million for the new DC whatever," that doesn't mean anything to me. Like I can tell they're throwing a lot of money at it. Cool. How many big actors are in it? Where is it being shot? That's going to tell me a little bit more about the craft behind it, because if it's like filmed in a one room and there's only a cast of six and the budget is that high, what the hell?
Right.
Like
Right.
where? What?
What are they spending their money on? So,
Yeah.
is there so when you're thinking about this and you're looking at this, is there like a sort of ratio you're looking for in a film? Like, is it a red flag, for instance, if you're spending like so the one that you gave, the example that you gave on the slide is almost 50-50, right? It's 33 million above the line, 38 million below the line,
Mm-hmm.
total of like 70, between 71 and 72 million dollars, right? If you were to see a film that was like, 80% above the line and 20% below the line, that'd be a red flag. Or the other way around? Like, is the other way around
No,
good?
I
Like, is it
no, I mean, but no, but it would be telling. So, I mean, if you didn't tell
okay?
me what film this was for and you handed me a budget and I could see that 20% was above the line and 80% was below the line, I'm immediately going to think Transformers or Battleship or something like that, that is like super CG, no big name cast, and not a huge focus on story development or script costs. Well, there might be script costs on both of those because they're based on games
Right, right,
and
right.
cartoons. So there might be more of like an IP purchase to get the rights to that. But I mean,
Right.
if it's like not a big name cast and a huge post production budget, then that's just
Mm-hmm.
going to tell me it's a whole lot of effects. Like maybe we're in space, but we don't know anybody who's in space.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You
Okay.
can make some assumptions about the movie based on the budget, but I don't think you can tell if it's good or bad. It's just going to tell you a little
Okay.
bit about how it was put together.
Okay. So it isn't necessarily true that like films that spend a lower percentage of their budget below the line are tending to be like, skimping, and therefore it's no. Okay.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it depends how you do it. I mean, maybe they don't shoot at night. It's a lot cheaper to shoot during the day.
Right.
Maybe they, I don't know, shelved their historic thing and moved it up to modern day. That's a lot cheaper too. So there's a
Right.
lot of different factors that I think can play into that. but a budget would not clarify to me if something was right, wrong, good, or bad. A
Mm-hmm.
budget is just interesting. Isn't
Right.
that interesting?
Right. It
Especially
just.
when I'm comparing loads of things. So like when I was doing all the PhD research, I was comparing like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Twilight, Hunger Games, and the budgets just varied massively, but the box office returns were all pretty similar.
Okay.
So like they made a buttload of money,
Right.
but some of them had to spend a whole lot more
Right.
and some didn't. So just kind of the nuance of that I find really interesting, but it's not going to tell me if that film was done well or not.
Right. Right. Okay.
And then marketing's a
Interesting.
whole other budget. The marketing's not part of the film budget.
So that's not part of this. I see a line for publicity, but that's a different thing, or
Sometimes it's included just baseline, especially for indies, it may be included, but usually that's part of the distribution process. So if you have a
okay.
distribution company that bought the rights to distribute that film,
I
then
see.
they would have a separate budget. So again, King Arthur's fresh in my head, but their marketing budget was 100 million. So the film was 175. The
Holy
marketing
cow!
was 100.
A
So they
hundred
spent
million dollars just for
270.
marketing.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, wow.
right?
That is
Like,
amazing.
guys, did you really think that was going to come back?
Wow.
And think of the above line for that. It couldn't have been that much. Like, none of those guys were huge names except Jude Law. And how big is Jude Law? Like,
Right.
yeah. Anyway,
Probably not a very significant percentage of 175
but that
million.
is interesting when we think about Amazon because none of these actors are big names.
Are
So
big
that's
budget names, yeah.
probably, but there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. Yeah. 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 Large cast, but not as you say. We're not getting together the, you know. I mean, this is not the Avengers,
Yeah,
essentially.
we're not going to see this movie because of the talent. We're going to see this
Yeah.
movie because it's Middle Earth.
Yeah. 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 Interesting. Okay. Well, so you were thinking about doing a little comparison in some of the time we have left between
Yeah.
Bakshi, New Line, and Amazon, right? Thinking about this kind of trifecta here. What were your sort of initial thoughts about comparing these three film? Of course, we haven't seen the one yet, but
I'm like regretting that we did this because it's such a can of worms, isn't it?
it kind of is.
But
It kind of
I
is.
mean, it's
There's
it's also just really interesting, you know. I mean, I think you could say all three of these are passion projects from the different creators. We don't know a ton about the passion behind the Amazon one, and I think that's part of the problem too. We don't have a person attached to the Amazon one yet.
there's no
They're
Peter Jackson,
trying.
who's the
Yeah, we
yeah.
don't have Bakshi, we don't have Peter Jackson. Like, I think they're trying with the showrunners and they're trying to show us that they're fans, but it doesn't feel organic yet. It doesn't feel valid.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean that as in like they need to prove themselves to us, but it is comforting to a fandom when that person can speak the same language as them and easily reference some of the world that they know so well. And we
Yeah.
haven't had that from these guys.
Right, right. Well, and it's, I mean, I think in large part also part of the secrecy in which they've been operating, I mean, intense secrecy in which they've been
Mm,
operating, it kind of works against them in this way, right? I mean, you know, Peter Jackson was trying to keep things secret, especially at the beginning as well. Um, but he was always a kind of front man for the
mhm.
whole project, right? And of course, if there's one thing that obviously Peter Jackson did very well, it was pitching this film, right? So having him as the kind of front man and center point to, I mean, it was easier to kind of get to know him. And as you say, like it's hard for people in the modern world, you know, in the 21st century, even to remember Peter Jackson's status before the Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings films. I mean, he was nobody. He had produced
right.
a handful of like B horror movies,
Yep.
and that was it. Like nobody, almost nobody knew his someone. Nobody had seen his stuff. He had very little respect. Like that was it was, and so I remember very clearly the anxiety at the very beginning when this was first talked about. Everyone was like, "Oh my
Who the hell
gosh,
is
this is
this?
going to be a complete disaster."
Yeah.
You know, this guy, you know, this random horror movie. I mean, like all of the like, you know, Freddy
Well,
Krueger
and
goes to Mordor. Like it was there was a lot of
yeah,
anxiety about that. But he was able he because he was this sort of spokesperson, right? And his passion for Tolkien was clear. Even I think before the films came out,
yeah,
and we were able to kind of latch on. People were able to. Not everybody was, willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but it improved.
And I'd be so curious about the conversations between like marketing and PR and the studio and Jackson around that, because I want to know if there were conversations, because it felt like there weren't, and it was just Peter Jackson saying, "Nope, I'm a really big fan." I mean, he was dressed up like a hobbit in some of the promotion. He was holding the smoking pipe, leaning up against a tree.
Right.
He was running around set carrying a battered copy of The Lord of the Rings. Like, we saw these things in any promo or leaked whatever that just helped. And maybe that was purposeful. Maybe they did that to convince us, but it worked. So I don't care. There's a certain level of like, just assure the fandom. And I'm not saying that's your role, but it's going to help you a lot if you just have a quick conversation and acknowledge them and put them at ease. Then they're going to spend a buttload of money to come see your film a million times.
Yeah. It's a great point. Nameless Arcanum says, I think the production team feeling so faceless is adding fuel to the criticism that it's going to be a soulless corporate production. Yes, I totally agree. And as Aslan's Compass adds, in the absence of information, people assume the worst, right? So yes, I agree. I can kind of understand why Amazon did what they did, secrecy wise. I'm not a big fan of like how draconian apparently they were about this. Like, I kind of feel a little bit like, get a grip, folks. It's not actually changing the world, but nevertheless, I do think that this is one of the ways in which it's kind of backfired. I don't know any reason to think that there is not a commensurate level of Tolkien passion behind this production. There may very well be. I think the people involved, the actors and the directors and the showrunners and whatever, may be just as knowledgeable, just as passionate as the Peter Jackson folks were. And I mean that both ways, right? Not everybody in the Peter Jackson production, especially the cast, were like dedicated Tolkien people at the time. I mean, of course, Christopher Lee gets a lot of credit, because he was, but he's the story because he's unusual in the cast for being like the lifelong Tolkien geek among them. But anyway, whatever. It may well be that the Amazon people are just as passionate, but we don't know. We barely know anything about who they are. We got introduced to them a little bit. So good. Yeah.
And that can be a total strength too, that you don't have somebody that knows word for word every single thing. Like, you want a few of those people that can help drive the depth and the heart of a story. But if everybody knows everything, then you are just a slave to fidelity. And as we said before, that doesn't always make for a good entertainment. Like, sometimes you have to make some changes. So it's nice when there's a few people that can help drive the ship, which would be the showrunners, or the producer, depending. I saw that in the questions.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that, because it's the dumb question I forgot to ask. Yeah,
they're pretty much the same thing. Showrunner you hear often in TV shows because there's going to be lots of episodes per season. So if there's like 10 episodes per season, the showrunner is going to be in charge of the whole thing. They're like the exec producer. They're overseeing. They're the major project manager. But they might have like multiple directors, multiple writers, working on these different things. So they're just going to be like the umbrella person.
And do they tend to? Is it usually true that the showrunners are like overseeing like sort of creative control over the whole series, or is their oversight more kind of logistical?
I'm gonna say creative, because I don't know a ton of showrunners, but the ones that I know were very heavily involved in the vision of the piece. So they were helping with like art decisions and costuming and lighting. So they were very involved in the creative construction as well as the logistics.
Right. Because I mean, it's obviously, I mean, one of the things that you've been saying from the very beginning is just to remember how many cooks are in this kitchen in any production of anything. You've got all these people with all these different tastes and visions and things like that, which is one of the reasons why we've been spending so much time talking about producers and directors and showrunners, because like the people who bring these things together and try to get, if you just let everybody, right, if you let the lighting people do what they think is cool, and the sound people do what they think is cool,
Mm-hmm.
and then then you're going to get something that just is going off in 10 different directions and has
It's
no
never
kind
gonna
of
work. Yeah.
central vision at all. So that's why these organizations, these project manager people, are so important, right? Okay, so the showrunner does tend to be creatively involved. Is the is the showrunner usually involved in the writing, or
They
do
can
they
be.
work with the
Yeah.
writers? They can be.
Yeah, I mean, not always. They could be hired on, later on because the studio needs a showrunner to actually make it happen. So it
So
could
you've got a
be a
script
thing
and
brought in
they
later.
hire in a showrunner.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess if you're talking about something that has a fan following, like my inclination would be get a showrunner that's involved early on because you want them as part of the development process. So
Right.
they understand all the pieces that come together and can see that big picture. Also, that could be fun because if you're talking about something with Easter eggs, that's the kind of stuff you could plop in a little bit later. So you want to have somebody that's part of the whole process.
Right.
Not always possible, but yeah, I mean, ideally
Right.
that's what you would aim for.
Right. And that's true. This is another thing that I often forget about is the not just the kind of horizontal complexity of like many different people participating, but like the vertical, like in time complexity. Like you've got the one phase of the project and the other, and I kind of forget about the extent to which many of the people involved in one phase or other of the production process are just like nowhere involved at all in the
Hmm.
other parts, right? So like you do your filming, right, and then like all the camera people are done, right? All the cast is done, and now you're bringing in this whole new set of people who now are, so now you've got this whole other set of team, and so yeah, so having somebody who has that continuity across all of those things, really
Oh yeah, there's
important as
loads of
well.
stories of like, these super secret sets that only give you the pages that you're shooting that day. So you might only have seen
Right.
4 pages of the script and things like that. So like
Right.
you need to have somebody that gets the big picture. And then that could just be the big picture of that film. Like when I was on Captain America, I remember there was a dude that was there, never said a word, just kind of creepily hung out in the background. But his job was to make sure that everything stayed within the Marvel world. Like he
Okay.
knew there's what
He was like the
20.
parallel to the Tolkien estate person, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. He knew the whole arc of Marvel and just made sure things stayed on track.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Interesting.
quality
Interesting.
control.
Quality control. Yeah. And
Yeah.
we do know, by the way, that the Tolkien estate was working with I mean, they did have approval rights on the Amazon production. This is another thing that I keep wanting to come back to. When people talk about and again, I feel like this is the second time now that I feel like I'm trying to encourage people to be angry at the Tolkien estate, and I'm totally not. But I am a little bit puzzled at like there's all of this anger and distrust that's
Mm.
all being channeled in Amazon's direction, and it's like the people who are talking about like, oh, they're going to like Tolkien will be destroyed, by this production, and I'm like, what?
Well,
the
Tolkien said it was okay.
the Tolkien
Yeah.
estate is overseeing this whole thing, right? So
Yeah.
like they've approved this whole
Yeah.
deal. So like it's and I'm not saying that like everything the Tolkien estate agrees with and approves is awesome. Like that's not true, and I might differ from them, but this is not just like Amazon has like gone rogue and has stolen Tolkien and is gonna wreck it
Yeah.
wantonly,
Well, and
or
we
for
still
their own
we still
ends.
don't know.
Right. We still don't know. Right.
Yeah. Well, and like it started so strong with Amazon too. Do you remember the first trailer that they put out where I mean, I used it in film classes where it was like, here's how you get your fans. This is how you engage with them. Because it was showing the writer's room with people wearing Hobbit slippers and showing us the credentials they had in addition to what they were about to do. So it was like so and so from Stranger Things, so and so from Game of Thrones, so and so from Blitz. Like it was grounding it in all of these well loved, Tom Shippey was part of that original trailer. So we knew there was a
Right.
Tolkienist on board. Like the way they wove that trailer together was purely for fan satisfaction. It
Yes.
was just to reach out to us to say, we got this. It's going to be okay.
Right.
And that was years ago. That was before, all the speculation, all the change of crew and cast and everybody else. So they need that now. They need one of those things now to just kind of say, We got this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, yeah, agreed.
Which Jackson was so good at, he just, easily, like, I remember the One Ring.net guys, right? Like, weren't they just crashing set over and over again? And eventually Peter
Originally,
Jackson was like, yeah.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
eventually Peter Jackson was like, these are our people. We should probably have a conversation with them.
right, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
that was
The
a
day
very real,
when they stopped like calling the cops on them and began to work with them instead. Yes,
yeah, one
yes,
of them ended up being
that's the
hired as part of the crew. And yeah,
that's sort of the story.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
that's just such an organic, like, fan service, but also just a way for us to realize these guys do care about the story they're making and the people that they're making it for. And Bakshi's really famous for that one of, he ran out of money. He cared so much about the detail and the artistry that he didn't get to finish. And we don't have that. Like, the only thing I've heard so far is how mean they're being to other productions in New Zealand. And that's
right,
not filling me with comfort.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so we wanted to segue to an open Q&A. We still got about a half an hour to just kind of answer people's questions. We've had so many things to talk about. We didn't get a chance to talk about the trailer until last time, and we've had special guests and everything. And I haven't been able to do much of just like taking random questions and addressing like questions and concerns that people have. So we would very much like to do that. And Nameless Arcanum, I'll start with the question you just asked. Do we know if Christopher Tolkien had anything at all to do with the process of making this show, or was he out of the picture by that point? Out of the picture, I believe, is pretty clear. I remember the announcement, the initial announcement of the Amazon securing the rights to do a thing on the Lord of the Rings. It's one of those, like, I remember where I was moments, in particular since I was in a very unusual place. I was accompanying my wife to a conference in Hawaii, so I was in a hotel room in Hawaii when I read that news. So it's very like flashbulb memory in my mind where I was. But Nameless Arcanum, one of the things that made it such a salient thing for me, it was not just like, oh, rumor that a new production is coming out. That would have been big news on its own. But Edith, exactly that. There were two pieces of news that dropped at exactly the same time. As I recall, it was the same day, or maybe the day after. And that was Christopher Tolkien is stepping down as the president of the Tolkien estate. Amazon has purchased the rights to do the show. Those announcements were practically simultaneous. So it was very, very hard for me not to speculate on some kind of cause and effect. I'm not sure which was the cause and which the effect exactly, right? But it's certainly the alignment of those two announcements certainly seemed to me not coincidental. We know that Christopher Tolkien was not in support of film adaptations at all. He did not like the Peter Jackson films, and he never took that back, right? It was not like, I've said many times things like, I think the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films are brilliant movies. I'm not a huge fan of their adaptation of Tolkien in a lot of points. I think they're very good, very successful adaptations, but there are many things that I dislike about the way that they relate themselves to the books. So, years later, I'm able to, make a nice measured statement like that. Christopher Tolkien never took back his statements about how he thought the whole thing was like a bad idea and should not happen, and he would stop it if he could. He couldn't because J.R.R. Tolkien sold the film rights. So again, like, you want to point a finger, you have to point the finger straight at J.R.R. He took the money. And by the way, do you know Tolkien's... People know Tolkien's famous line about this, right? When people were offering for the film rights to The Lord of the Rings, he said, I will sell the rights under two, like, I need one of two things: cash or control. It won't take a lot of money if I can have artistic control. If I can maintain artistic control over the film, then I'm willing to play ball, right? But if I'm not allowed to have careful artistic control, then they better pony up a lot of money. That's what Tolkien said, and in the end, they
Fair.
ponied up a lot of money, right? And that was that was it. Anyway, like it is yeah. Christopher Tolkien was not on board. He wasn't part of that decision that his dad made. He wasn't. He just, he's not a fan. He's not a fan of screen adaptations, and I'm not bashing him for this. Like, it's fine. Like, I understand. Nemos Arcanum says he was probably the purest of purists. In some ways, sure. I mean, like, we're talking about the guy who dedicated his entire career at, like, publishing and protecting the, literary, like, reputation of his father, right? So no, he wasn't particularly thrilled about an adaptation whose creative control is going to be in somebody else's hands entirely, like that he could have no influence over necessarily, to say, like, okay, it's tough. It's tough. And now, praise, I agree with you that a lot of things in Tolkien are inherently difficult to translate into visual mediums. That was, of course, exactly Christopher's argument when he was saying, like, I think that these books are singularly ill-suited. I forget his exact phrase. Singularly ill-suited to representation in a visual medium. I don't agree with him entirely, but he's not entirely wrong either. There are a lot of things in Tolkien inherently difficult to translate into visual mediums. Praise, my own self, I would be tempted to say challenging to translate into visual mediums, because I think it's possible, but hard. And I think it's easy to do badly. Like, for instance, when you decide, in order to try to convey what's going on between Gandalf and Saruman, when Saruman is on the balcony of Orthanc after the flood, you have him chuck a fireball at Gandalf, right? Like, that's one, in my opinion, quite clumsy attempt to translate what is a very non-visual thing going on there, the battle of wills between the two of them. They were trying there. I don't think that was a success, but there are other ways in which you can do things. I mean, there are things that you can do. There are definitely ways. There are some ways in which you can convey non-verbal, non-visual even more powerfully in film than you can in a book. You have to kind of explain it and belabor. You have to say it is happening, right? Whereas you can just kind of make people feel it more viscerally and directly in a film. So,
and that's when you're hoping that you have a creative team that has that kind of ability to communicate with each other. Because if you're talking about emotion or depth or something that you feel from words that we're trying to get on screen, then you need to consider the music, which doesn't happen until later, the lighting, which has to be decided before, the performance, which happens in the moment, but that actor might be tired and pissed off, and the director has to manage that. There's so many lovely little factors that have to come together that, yeah, they might try something and it fails. And the other thing with Peter Jackson is, like, so much new technology was used in those special effects and images and stuff that they were just trying stuff out. So if it didn't work, and who knows, they might have just been like, we have a new toy, can we throw a fireball? I wasn't part of that conversation.
Right.
So
right.
You can try it, but we also might throw it away and say nope.
Which they did. They cut that scene from the cinematic release. Anyway, so no, it's but I do think, like, in my mind, those are really fun artistic challenges, right? But this is yet another reason why it is so important, when you are a fan of a book which is being adapted to screen, you absolutely have to be fair. You don't have to like it. Again, we'll keep saying you don't have to like it, but you have to be fair in judging. This is why you can't just be like, they changed that. That's not what it says in the book, and start quoting word for word and saying, this is how the scene was described in the book, and they did it differently in the film, doggone it. Like, you have to first leave the book aside. And this is the hardest thing. Leave the book aside. Watch the scene, right? And say, like, try to understand, what is the scene doing? What's happening in that scene? Then compare that to that, right? Look at what's happening in the book. Look at what's happening in the scene. What are they trying to accomplish, and how are they trying to accomplish that, right? And how successful are they in accomplishing what each, and then compare those things, right? And that to me is what it really comes down to when you're trying to evaluate, like, is this true to the work? Mm-hmm. It's not about the details. It's not about citing, chapter and verse to say they deviated in this thing. So but that's because it's such a different challenge. It is such a different challenge. You may have to make. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I like Life S's comment here. Different is not equal to bad, and different is not equal to wrong. That's what I say to my mom whenever she's talking about something over here in the UK, where she's like, "That's weird." I'm like, "It's not weird. It's different." Right. It's just a different way of doing things, but it gets, right. She said that about our power plugs in the wall, because you have to turn them on. There's a switch on the actual power plug where you plug something in, and she always forgot about it. Like, it's not weird. It's just different, but it gets the job done. So if we're able to do something like that in the film and say, yep, it's different than the book, but hey, it got the job done. Like, those two examples I did in the beginning were like, yeah, I miss those 50 pages or whatever of, well, I don't really miss those 50 pages of Harry wandering aimlessly through the woods and getting frustrated because it was long and boring.
I've never.
But if I can accomplish that in 8 seconds of film, great.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. It is all about what you're accomplishing, and again, the challenge of doing that. It is very possible for you to change a lot of things around very significantly in order to create to try to capture the very same thing that is being captured in the book. So that's why you can't just be so quick to say it's different, and therefore it's wrong.
And sometimes that's a real gift, because if they're changing something in order to give me more time somewhere else, I could be incredibly grateful for that. Like, again, that example I had from Aragon, where they cut loads of story just so they could show that CG dragon. That doesn't do anything for me. But if they cut some of these other elements so I get more time developing a character or a story arc, great.
Right.
Great.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Good. So let's see. Another question. Edith says, what about films that basically have nothing left from the book except perhaps a couple characters? Well, again, at the end of the... I have a quick, obvious example of that in my head. How to Train Your Dragon. Do you know that? Do you know the
I love the movie. I've never read the book.
Okay, so that's the funny thing, is that apart from the names of the characters, there's almost no connection between the story and, like, it's almost it is to me, it is uncanny how different that. And that one struck me because we had just read How to Train Your Dragon. Is a hilarious book, and we Stoic the Vast is one of the best character names I know. I mean, it's just great. We love How to Train Your Dragon. We watched the film and we were like, huh.
Oh.
And the thing is, it's not like it was a terrible movie. It was a good movie. I kind of liked the movie, but we're just like, that, why did you link it to the book? Because almost everything about it was completely different. I mean, and I'm not saying like they approached it differently. I mean, like fundamentally, like, again, it's like the entire plot is turned on its head. The characters, not all of the characters are entirely different, completely, but many. I mean, it's just that I couldn't even wrap my brain around the kind of departures that they did, and I'm just like, why you had this interesting idea for a movie? Like, I just. Yeah, like how you get from point A to point B. I don't understand.
And I don't have an answer for that, except it had to have been something in the room that happened, that somebody got carried away and just ended up running with it, and 6 months later, that's the final script. But sorry, all my examples are Twilight. This is what I know. But like Twilight, one of the first drafts of Twilight, Bella was a track star at Brigham Young University, and Edward was a convict on the run from the FBI. There was no mention of vampire. There was nothing, but it was called Twilight, and their names were Bella and Edward. Okay. So like, what happened? And I think that was MTV, which is now defunct. So clearly somebody made a lot of bad decisions. But
Right.
sometimes they just take the title of a book in the
Yeah.
hopes it will attract some following and help get it made because it sold X amount of copies. And it's the same as like having that first author or that producer name. It's like whatever gets it made. If somebody in the room has the money and says, wouldn't it be a great idea? Maybe that's how it gets messed up.
Right.
Doesn't help me as a fan. That helps me as a creator understand how it happened, but I don't
Right.
feel good about it. I mean, that happened with
Yeah.
Susan Cooper. They changed all sorts of stuff in My Dark is Rising. How dare they? And I couldn't tell you if the resulting film was good because I couldn't breathe. So I don't know.
Yeah. 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 It's now. Uh, Lifasa says, oddly with Game of Thrones,
Mm.
season 1 feels exactly like book 1 on the screen, but they deviate so enormously as they go. Now that's a different situation, because of course they overtook and passed the series, right?
Well,
Um,
and
yeah.
True
So
Blood and Harry Potter did very similar things, and I feel like that's to secure an audience, and then you can deviate. So like once you know you've got your watching audience and you've got millions of people that are tuning in and loads of people that are watching it that haven't read the book and all of them are happy, then you can play around with it. By the third film, doesn't really matter if you follow the
right.
book or not. Everybody's going to watch.
Right. Yeah. No, like I said, I don't just mean, I know that they deviate hugely before the books stop. But the reason I still say it's a different situation is that um, they they had a shape in mind. Like they made decisions about where the our overall arc of the story was going. Now, I know everybody hates where the story went in the end. Like I get that. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying you're making the show, you have to work out the arcs. You have to know where you're going. Um, howsoever, they could not just follow every book along and then like, and now we're going to start extemporizing, right? They had to, you know, if you've got the beginning and the middle and you don't have the end, you can't, like, you have to shape the beginning and the middle towards the end. Like that's kind of how you have to make up the story, and they don't know what's going on there. So I don't blame them at all. For I would have done exactly the same thing. Like basically, you know, if I had been on the writing team of Game of Thrones, well, it would have been different. But if I had been on the writing team of the Game of Thrones, I'm not saying it would have been better. I'm just saying it would have been different. Is I would have said, okay, we're definitely going to start, you know, where he starts, right? But we are going to make up our own minds about where we're going, because we're not going to have material to be working with there, right? And if we're going to be headed towards that destination, we're going to have to make our own choices about where we're going in the middle. We can't use his middle not knowing what his end is. So for me, I think it's totally totally justifiable. It's in any case, it's not the same situation. It's not the same situation as something like How to Train Your Dragon, where they're like, we're doing an adaptation of the book, except it's
We're
not.
not.
There's
Yeah.
Vikings and dragons, and that's mostly it. Is the only similarity, primarily. So
God.
yeah, yeah. Um, but it is strange. So I mean, I would certainly not consider. To me, the thing that matters most, more than anything else, is it a good movie? That's always the first question. Is it a good movie? Like again, How to Train Your Dragon. I'm not mad about How to Train Your Dragon. I'm a little disappointed
Hmm.
because I think How to Train Your Dragon is brilliant. But the movie is a good movie. That's fine. Like it exists in its own like separate place, and I could watch the movie and I can read the book, and it's I don't consider it a good adaptation. I mean, it's like a weird spin-off kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's a like retelling a story that most people hadn't heard. But
This feels like a poorly titled, you know? You could be like From the World of How to Train Your Dragon,
something like
perhaps, you
that.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean, I also feel like it's important to say you're very much allowed to like both the book and the film, even if they're totally different.
Even if they're
This
totally
is not a
different.
competition. This is not a
Right.
death battle. You're allowed to
Right.
like both.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, again, I wouldn't call it a good adaptation because,
Yeah.
again, like in my opinion, what makes a good adaptation is how it's interacting with the book, right? What that doesn't mean it has to be. It can be dangerously adapt a Tolkien quotation here, and actually, we might want to come back to this, and I might want to think about this parallel more. I think it's okay for an adapter to be a lover of the original and not its slave. Like Tolkien talks about writing fantasy and being a lover of nature and not its slave. I think that that's okay. But are there like movies that I would consider bad adaptations? Absolutely. There are bad adaptations.
Yeah, because you're also evaluating it that way in terms of a craft. You're not saying it's a good movie or a bad movie. You're saying in terms of like, I hate to use the word fidelity, but if that's what we're talking about, faithfulness to the text, then it's not. And if we're not talking word for word, you could be talking about spirit. And that's like a really difficult thing to, focus in on and define. But in terms of, that's craft. That's not media product. That's
Right.
not a good movie. That's a well-crafted process.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Good. Other questions you guys would like us to talk about? So, I mean, one of the things that we, it would be really fun, Maggie, to look at some examples. It's kind of hard because not everybody's going to know, the films or the books, for these other examples. It'd be fun to just look at some other like classic examples of like, here's a good adaptation and what makes it good as an adaptation. Right. And here's some examples.
And what's the definition of good?
Yeah, exactly. What do we mean when we say it's a good adaptation? And obviously, anytime you're saying that's good or that's bad, everybody should always know that's a really sloppy thing to say, right? There's always more to be said than those single words. But anyway, to look at some examples of what we think are really good adaptations and what makes them good, right? And some things that we think are bad adaptations and what makes them bad. It would be interesting to because there are a bunch of examples that come to mind that I'd be really interested to talk about. Even and to even look at some ways in which you have good adaptations that change little and good adaptations that change a lot, and bad adaptations that change little and bad adaptations that change a lot.
Or short stories that made for an incredible film, or a video game that made for an incredible film. There's a ride.
The
Pirates.
adaptation into different genres as well would be really cool. So I think those would be interesting. One other thing that we've had a request to do, which I think we definitely will do, is to talk more about some of the previous Amazon adaptations, especially The Wheel of Time, which is kind of the most comparable thing to the Rings of Power that we've seen yet out of Amazon. And I'm delighted to talk about that. I'm a big Robert Jordan fan myself. I've been reading Robert Jordan since they first started coming out. And then I, as with so many other Robert Jordan fans, despaired. And then he died and Brandon Sanderson took over, and I regained hope and love. So I'm actually right now finishing another reread through the entire Wheel of Time series. I'm in book 11 right now, in my which I started when the Wheel of Time show came out. Like as soon as it was about to come out, I started rereading The Eye of the World, because I'm gonna reread it before I watch the adaptation, and then I started reading it, so I got to finish rereading the series.
And I still go the other way. I've never read it. I wanted to see it first, and then I was going to read it. So I'm not familiar with Wheel of Time. I watched it over Christmas break, and I should probably rewatch it before we talk about it. But we're also hoping we could maybe get somebody involved that knows it really well or worked on it or something. So yeah, definitely something we want to look at, just not there yet.
Yeah. So we might do a couple episodes on that. Maybe one, where you and I kind of talk about it talk about you can talk about what you see not knowing the book, and I can talk about
Mm-hmm.
what I see knowing the books, and then we can talk to some others who know the production, or who are kind of part of that world a
And to
little
see
bit
if there's
more.
any tie into the production of Lord of the Rings, because it could be there totally separate. It's just the pot of money is Amazon. So,
Yeah,
just because Wheel of Time had pros or cons doesn't mean Rings of Power could have pros or cons.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But it is interesting to look at some of the kinds of
Definitely.
the choices that they made. And I'll give everybody a little spoiler. I kind of liked the Wheel of Time adaptation. I was. A lot of people were upset. I was less upset than most Jordan fans that I saw, and I think for similar kinds of reasons. I thought there are some massive adaptation challenges in doing the Wheel of Time. I mean, it's a 14,000 page series, for crying out loud, right? I mean, it's long. And I mean, The Hobbit is challenging to adapt into films. People were joking about, oh, you're like making it into 3 films. That's way too much. And I'm like, it's still less than an unabridged reading of the book. I mean, like, you still have to compress to get it into 3 films, even.
Hmm.
It's like this is one of the things that I think that a lot of people take for granted, is the fact that the literary parallel of the feature film is not the novel, it's the short story, right? As far as like the pacing of the story and the shape of the narrative and how much you can do and how you develop characters and things, what you can do in a 300-page novel, it's not even fair to try
Yeah.
to do it. So like the job of compression that has to happen anytime you try to do a feature film on. This is one of the reasons why I am so glad. Like, the number one thing I've been happiest about from the day they announced the Amazon show was that they were going to do a serial production, so that
Yeah.
we could get some longer development and
Time.
not trying to squeeze it into
Hmm.
films. I've come to dislike the feature film. I'm not a huge fan of the short story as a genre. Like, it's not one of my favorite genres of literature. I prefer longer works. And therefore, I'm not a big fan of feature films. Like, I mean, like, as a genre, it's not my favorite. Um, give me, I'm very much of the, C.S. Lewis. There's that famous C.S. Lewis quote, right? He never found he never found a book long enough or a cup of tea big enough to suit him, right? That's me, absolutely. Like, the longer the better. I like long books. And this is why I'm so interested in Marvel and what Marvel's been doing. The way they've
Mm.
taken the feature film and used it for this like long-term storytelling, I think is a fascinating adaptation of the genre, which I think has been really, really cool. But
I love all
anyway,
those things.
yeah,
Yeah, I do love the feature film, especially when it can be tied up in a nice little bow when it follows a beautiful arc, and you have the 30-minute act one. I do love that whole structure, but
sure.
I also love when it fits into a cinematic universe of 27 films, and I get, so many more stories. And, if somebody tells me that there's a new book coming out of a series I love, then yeah, bring it on.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's pros and cons to all of it. I did want to say to First Fish, yes, I do think we should talk about Good Omens, because I loved both
Good
versions
Omens.
of that book, and
Yeah.
yeah, Good Omens. And
Hmm.
Neil Gaiman has some really good comments on adaptation and the process of, because he's quite involved in most of his adaptations. So I think that would be a good one to take a
Yeah,
look at too.
yeah. We can talk about Good Omens. Yeah, I did watch that adaptation as well as reading the book. So yeah. No, I mean, I think these are definitely a lot to talk about, which of course we're gonna eventually we're going. I'm waiting. Like, now, I have to admit, I'm all like spooked from like getting nothing from Amazon for a long time, and then getting like deluged by all that stuff all at once, and now we've got nothing again for a long time. So I'm just like waiting for like the next
The
flood
next thing.
to happen, right? So I'm kind of like looking over my shoulder twitchily as I'm waiting for that. So, but certainly in the there's still a bunch of time between now and September, and there'll be more to talk about. More primary material to talk about as we go through. But we will
We were also asked
we will
if we
see.
would finish the posters.
We
I'm
never did get to finish the posters.
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
like, I'm
yeah.
happy to, but we know so much more about those characters now. We
It's
don't
it's,
really
it's
need
kind
to
of hard to
speculate.
recreate that
Yeah.
moment in a sense. Yeah, and we can look at them, um, and maybe what we'll do is like when some of these other things come up, we can come back to some of the ones that we didn't talk about at the time.
Hmm.
But yeah, it is really hard after the trailer to recreate that moment of like trying to
We
draw
didn't know
conclusions
anything
based on
then.
what we're seeing. Yeah, um, that was kind of fun. But anyway, yeah. So we'll definitely talk about Wheel of Time. We'll definitely talk about Good Omens. Oh, and Dune. Oof. Yes, we could talk about Dune.
Uh,
Um,
well,
there's a lot there.
did a Mythgard movie. Start with that,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Amy Sturgis joined us. It was great.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, that was a doozy.
there's a great there's a great panel discussion on Mythgard miscellaneous. So if you look at the film club recording, which should be on YouTube, you should be able to look at that, see an awesome panel of folks talking about the Dune adaptations. But yeah, I mean, of course, I'm interested in. You guys know I'm interested in Dune as well, and we could talk about some of those as examples as well. But anyway, oh great, Kat was just attempting if Moobot will permit her to post a link. Oops, accidentally hit a key. There we go. All right. Well, as it happens, I've accidentally hit a key, which reminds me that we're at the end of our time.
Perfectly timed. Well done.
Yeah, excellent. So thanks, folks. We'll come back to questions and stuff next time. I have a series of questions that we're also going to be trying to intersperse in. There's a lot of things I would like to talk about just in the pure, more sort of, for those of you who have been listening to me for a long time, a sort of Riddles in the Dark-esque kind of series that I would like to do of just like, how are they going to handle this, to be thinking about some of the categories of things that are going to be really interesting adaptation challenges for them in thinking about the Second Age material. How are they going to handle the relationship between Eregion and Lyndon? How are they going to handle Gil-galad's character? How are they going to handle Galadriel? We've seen a good bit, but not all that much, about what Galadriel's doing. How are they going to handle her character and what she means in Tolkien's world? How are they going to handle Sauron and the villains, right? How are they going to handle the dwarves and the relationship between the dwarves and the elves? How are they going to handle the humans and the hobbits? So there's a lot of questions like this that I have that I would love to just kind of dig into each of those separately. So we have a lot to talk about. Plus, we're hoping for another guest next week, so turn in for that. We might not necessarily do every other week rigidly with special guests, but we are going to be bringing in special guests fairly regularly as well, because it's fun to hear from other folks here as well. So anyway, thanks very much for joining us, everybody. We will see you guys again next week. Thanks, Maggie. I really appreciate your patience answering all of my ignorant questions today. That was very helpful.
Not ignorant at all, and I love that every answer I gave you was, I don't really know, but here's some thoughts.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
See ya.